Welcome to our first leasehold reform vlog. My name is Chrissy Smales. I'm a professional support lawyer in the commercial real estate team here at Cripps. I'm very pleased to welcome today Anna Favre. Anna is the head of our London and Urban Estates sector team. Now, last year, what with building safety, planning, leasehold and corporate reform all jostling for centre stage, it seemed really that there was nothing that wasn't being reformed. But there's no doubt that as we settle into 2025, leasehold reform, bolstered and partnered by its cousin, the Renters' Rights Bill, is enjoying the limelight significantly. In terms of the legal landscape more generally, we've seen a pattern over the last couple of years. Major pieces of legislation such as the Building Safety Act and the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act of 2023, they're enacted, but actually the provisions of those acts are brought in by way of secondary legislation and regulation. What this does is creates uncertainty in the intervening period, and uncertainty is one thing that the markets certainly don't embrace. That is a pattern that we've seen very much in terms of leasehold reform as well. During the course of last year, what with the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act and also the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act being rushed through in the wash-up, as well as the Renters' Reform Bill, now known obviously as the Renters' Rights Bill, we spent a lot of time and energy talking about reform of residential property market. But of course, we're still awaiting a lot of the proposed changes. There's no doubt that the government's plans for leasehold reform are extremely ambitious. For now, though, in terms of implementing change, the government have recognised that there's a need to balance speed with care to ensure that the measures that are brought into force are to the lasting benefit of leaseholders and residential freeholders. So, Anna, perhaps you could give us an overview of the changes that we think will actually come into force this year.
Thank you, Chrissy. Well, as you've already said, we've had the introduction of the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act, which was introduced in last year's wash-up. With that, we're awaiting much of that legislation to come into effect through secondary legislation. Most recently, we have seen changes to the right to manage threshold. We've gone from 25% to 50%, which means much more mixed-use buildings will now qualify. We can expect to see more changes of that nature, I think, coming down the line later this year. But before we get there, there will be certain consultations that will be carried out, for example, in relation to the valuation methodology, which has been completely revised. That's the valuation methodology applicable to enfranchisement claims, completely revised. Many of the provisions, as you will know, are quite controversial. They're subject to judicial review and being challenged under the Human Rights Act and ostensibly a breach of convention rights. So one of the key issues is the consultation on the rates applicable to that valuation methodology. If the deferment rates go in favour of leaseholders, and certainly the flavour that seems to be coming through in terms of the government's narrative is very leasehold focused, they're very much looking at empowering leaseholders, then we can expect to see valuation becoming significantly more favourable for leaseholders. Whether we will see that this year remains to be seen, but certainly we can expect to have those consultations. We can probably expect to see some other provisions coming in under LAFRA, but as you've already alluded to, the key omission, I suppose, from the recent legislation was in respect of Commonhold. And Labour has promised us a Commonhold and Leasehold Reform Bill, which will be introduced, we are told, at the back end of this year. And in that, they will seek to enact the remaining Law Commission recommendations that were set out in their 2020 report on leasehold reform. Now, that is a very ambitious plan indeed, and whether we will get there remains to be seen. I think we already have a fairly packed legislative agenda. And of course, as we all know, politicians may have very good ideas about how to reform things. It's a matter of time, isn't it? But we can certainly continue to see a lot of movement around this area. And an interesting point around Commonhold is exactly how one would deal with conversion to Commonhold, particularly in cities where you have a predominantly leasehold-focused form of home ownership.
And in terms of LAFRA, so the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act, the government have identified what they call a small number of specific but very serious flaws which would prevent certain provisions from operating as intended and that need to be rectified via primary legislation. Yes. It's for that reason really why we don't think reform is absolutely imminent. Should we talk a little bit more about those specific flaws?
Yes, tantalisingly, we heard Matthew Pennycook allude to the primary, or rather the defects which would necessitate primary legislation to rectify, and he didn't actually give us much information on what he meant by that. And that was in his statement of the 21st of November last year, which of course you've talked about. What we have now heard through monitoring parliamentary debate is it would appear to relate to the valuation methodology in respect of compensating intermediate landlords for their loss. There was apparently some loopholes there, and certain other elements which relate to the valuation methodology. So I think it's fair to say that the danger with any legislation which is rushed is that you will find there are certain defects in it if it's not carefully thought through. We're all familiar, aren't we, with the phrase of the law of unintended consequences. So one has to be careful that in seeking to empower one party, you don't either unduly disempower another to the extent that it's unfair, or perhaps there's a loophole that's been created in that process which perhaps wasn't seen before. So one has to take time, particularly as things become more complex. How long it will take to bring in yet more primary legislation, who knows? But I wouldn't expect to see anything of that nature until early next year.
And the government they've committed to act quickly, but we have got this interim period. What impact do you think this sort of limbo state really that we're in at the moment is going to have on the residential market?
Well, I think already, I mean, it's had a pretty chilling effect on the market. I mean, as we all know, as real estate practitioners, we are experiencing cyclical headwinds in terms of the state of the economy. Real estate, because of the creditworthiness of a lot of buildings subject to the statutory regimes that are at play, can be affected perhaps before some others. So I think it will continue to be in a challenging environment. I think it's also significant that the government, we have this judicial review going through, which is challenging LAFRA and associated legislation. So I think for the time being, uncertainty will continue to be the watchword. And of course, if there's one thing the market dislikes, it is uncertainty. So it's a challenging time, I think, for developers, for anybody who's investing in the real estate sector. It's not purely confined to one group or another. I don't see that position improving if we are then subject to potentially a two-tier system, if we start to introduce Commonhold piecemeal, which is one fear. For example, we have certain buildings which are subject to Commonhold, others will continue to be leasehold. The effect of that will be further downward pressure on the already extremely stretched leasehold market in terms of its value and indeed its reputation.
As you say, and the timeline for Commonhold seems quite far-fetched currently. I mean, a bill potentially the end of this year.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be looking at any changes potentially for a while yet. So it's clearly the elephant in the room when we're discussing leasehold reform.
Yeah.
At the moment, I think it's going to take the market time to adjust personally to what's proposed at the moment, and then it will be a second stage in terms of looking at
Absolutely. And I think I've just mentioned there, Chrissy, on Commonhold generally, I think it's really important not to create inadvertently this two-tier system, because it's very important, isn't it, if you want people to adopt this very novel form of home ownership, you either make it absolutely compulsory outright, which I think would be preferable, and it would need to work retrospectively, or you create incentives for people to take it up, otherwise it will fail in the way it did in 2003 when it came into effect.
And we're very excited to announce that we are developing a leasehold reform hub.
Yes.
And the idea being to collate all the knowledge, so in terms of legislative change and market practice going forward,
yes,
as we have this piecemeal development of this very key piece of legislation and real reform to the residential market. So please do keep an eye out for our hub on our website. And we'll also be providing updates by way of our Property Perspective circular, which goes out to anyone who has subscribed to that circular on a monthly basis. So please do take a look at that as well, and we will endeavour to keep you in the loop as things progress over the course of the next few months and indeed the rest of this year.